When there's nothing left but the fire in my chest and the air that fills my lungs, I'll hold my tears and
Welcome to Iron Rhetoric with your intrepid host, Pastor Brett McAtee. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own.
Well, whatever time of the day it is that you're listening, we're glad that you dropped in to listen on Iron Rhetoric. I'm Pastor Brett, along with Matt, my technician, Matt Smith, who I couldn't do this without. So we're very thankful for the work that he does. He does this as kind of a side gig. He's I guess you would say, a mini professional, and we're very thankful for his work here and all the technology stuff that goes on here at the church. A couple weeks ago, I finished a book that my associate pastor here recommended. He was reading it, and then it sounded so good the way that he was explaining it, I picked it up right away. And it's a book by a chap named Jeremy Carl, and the title of the book is The Unprotected Class. The subtitle is How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. I thought I would hit on this because in the last couple months, recent history, I've had a couple folks who I had thought were friends had pulled me aside and said, I really agree with you privately about the kinism issue, but it's costing me and my family too much to associate with you publicly. And so we're going to have to cut ties. And of course, I understand people wanting to protect their family. But another thing that was said was that this issue just isn't important enough for in order to be publicly ostracized was the gist. The way I translated it was it's just not a hill to die on. And that was disappointing. It's always disappointing when you lose a friend or somebody you thought was a friend. But that was back in March and beginning of February. It was bang, bang, back to back within a couple weeks. And then this book came around, at least to my attention, probably, this is June, so the middle of May, roughly. And the reason I gobbled it up so much, it was a bias confirmation, or I guess they call it confirmation bias, or which way does that go? Bias confirmation? Anyway, what Carl does here is he demonstrates that it is the case, and I'll try to put it mildly. The statistics demand more than mild, but what Carl demonstrates is that white people are being overwhelmingly discriminated against in America. And he takes chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter to show how that's the case in different realms and different fields. And the way that it confirms my kinism, or the way that it confirms kinism, is that it demonstrates that it is the case that there is an agenda, wherever the agenda is coming from. You might call it the elites. You might call it in other particular people groups having an axe to grind against white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and I would include Christians here. Whatever you want to say the source is, it's definitely the case that the white man is seeking to be diminished and his influence degraded here in America. And what Jeremy Carl has done is he's given us the receipts. He showed us chapter and verse in these different areas how this is so, and it just can't be denied. He admits, on one hand, it's an easy book to write because the evidence is just striking. It's just, in your face, you can't miss it. However, he also admits it's a difficult book to write. It was a difficult book to write because he knew the social and cultural consequences of what he was writing, the blowback that could indeed incur. Indeed, I would say that there's an attempt going on right now to drop this book down the memory hole already. There have been some reviews on it, but certainly it hasn't gotten the attention that one would have thought that it might have garnered. And so we're going to look at this a little bit. We're not doing an official book review. We're just going through the book, leafing through, drawing attention to particular different quotes to demonstrate that kinism is an issue that is a hill to die on. That if we get this wrong, that we're going to go into eclipse. And you cannot give the gospel of Christ to people who no longer exist, right? So if they're trying to snuff us out, if they're trying to degrade us, if they're trying to make us into wage slaves, and that's one thing that Carl argues is that they are trying to make us into wage slaves, then if all those things are true, then there isn't a people to give the gospel to. And so it does become a hill to die on. And to be honest, people who say things like it's not a hill to die on, or it's just not that important, or I agree with you privately, but I can't be seen with you publicly. What those people are doing, as understandable as it might be from one direction, what they're engaging in is what Francis Schaeffer called the pursuit of personal peace and affluence. It's a very normie-like attitude to try to protect yourself and yours. But Carl makes a point in the last chapter, and we won't get to the last chapter maybe today, but he makes a point in the last chapter. Look, unless more and more people are willing to stand up, unless they're willing to put their head in a chopping block, so to speak, maybe that's not the best metaphor to use, but unless more and more people are willing to stand up, this thing is going to keep rolling. And these people who think that they're protecting their family by not associating with people who are aware of this issue, they're actually going to do their family in the long run more harm. They might be able to save their children, maybe, but their grandchildren then becomes an open issue. And I guess also I want to address this because I'm just tired about being boxed on the ears about it. This is a position that the fathers have held throughout church history. There's nothing at all controversial except if you're a Marxist or if you're a cultural Marxist and you're somebody who's absorbed that mindset. You may not even think you've absorbed it. You might be considered on many other points, so to speak. But on this point, you're seeing, when you hear the word kinist, you freak out and you think racist. But this is the position I hold, the position that's mapped out in the book by Thomas Acord and Darrell Dow, who is my neighbor in Anthology of Natural Relations. This is the position that church is always held throughout church history until about, 1950, 1960 or so. The post-World War II consensus began to push in that direction, and it reached meltdown point with the civil rights legislation, which itself was driven by Marxist ideology. But maybe that's another Iron Ink program to show how the civil rights was really born of a Marxist attitude. Now, having said that, I can see people thinking, "Oh, there he is being racist." And you know what? You could be for the idea that all men be treated as men and not be for the civil rights legislation, the civil rights issues, the Title IX legislation, all that kind of stuff. And Carl goes into some of this stuff, not the civil rights so much, although he touches on it a little bit. But he goes into how it is the white man is being diminished. And we shouldn't be afraid of saying that or noticing that. It's odd. We're so worried about, that is, so many white people are so worried about being racist. And it just strikes me as, if you read Carl's book, you get to the end of the book and you say, well, that's kind of like being worried about being racist. That's kind of like the person going to the guillotine being concerned for the executioner. All right? It's okay that you want the executioner to go home and to be able to feed his family, but do you really want it to happen at the cost of your head being cut off? And so I think that's where we're at, where we've been so brainwashed and programmed into this concern of racism that we can't even notice the truth anymore and speak about it with any candor. And Jeremy Clark is to be saluted because he does that. He speaks with candor. I would say that at points that even Clark is sensitive to the prevailing cultural zeitgeist, because I do feel at points he pulls his punches. But the pulling of the punches comes more with the solutions he offers than in the analysis of the problem that he demonstrates. And so we'll just leaf through the book here and provide certain snippets from it, if you please. He starts out as an introduction quoting from Susan Sontag, where she says the white race is the cancer of human history. And then he demonstrates that how that thinking is often repeated in our current situation and circumstance. He quotes somebody from the Grace Church School who said in a secretly recorded conversation in 2021 here, he said, quote, "We're demonizing white people for being born. We're using language that makes them feel less than others for nothing that they are personally responsible for." Right? Now, this is the kind of idea that American white people are facing. And remember, this country was founded by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock. And here we are almost 250 years later now, and we're the ones that are being run out of town. As I said earlier, I'm quoting from Clark now. He says this book was difficult to write because demonstrating the thesis accurately is politically and socially fraught. Yeah, I understand that for sure. I've been the one that's been out on the ledge. I'm glad that Carl decided to get out here with me and others like me, other kinnists. Now, I don't know, I doubt he would call himself a kinnist, but he's definitely trotting down that path. He says it goes against the grain of what many Americans are taught by our media, our education system, and cultural apparatus about the so-called white privilege that supposedly rules America. And he says his book runs against the officially approved narrative. And in this particular category, this particular subject, if you go against the official narrative, you will be outlawed. You will find yourself hated by the institutional Reformed Church and other expressions of the institutional church. You will be given the Ryan Turnip Seed treatment of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. You'll be given the Michael Spangler treatment of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. If you go against the official narrative, you will be outcast. You'll be called racist. Any number of pejoratives will be hurled at you. You'll make the mid-Michigan media, all the newspapers and the radio outlets, denouncing your name across who knows how wide of a spectrum. And not only once did I find myself as the headline of the Lansing State Journal, but twice they ran not my name, but my association at the top of the mass. And I guess there's a little maybe bitterness bleeding through here. I don't mean for that to happen, but I am getting tired of something standing for something that all through church history the fathers have stood for, that has been the position of the church in all times and in all places where the church has granted or God has granted the church grace to be orthodox, and standing in this great line of fathers saying what they said once upon a time. People like Jeremy Clark, people like Spangler and Turnip Seed, people like myself are being cut off at the knees. And they're being cut off by the knees by people who, there's no doubt they're well-intentioned, I think. And maybe in some lights, as I said earlier, they could be called conservative. But they have drank the Kool-Aid on this particular subject. Carl goes on to say, adding to the challenge of a book like this is that there's also a certain noblesse oblige, particularly among traditional white elites, that is repelled by any notion that whites would acknowledge real threats to their status or rights. He says it's just not done. He goes on in an introduction and he says, simply put, it's foolish to pretend that wrongs being done to white people under our current system aren't being done because they're white. Right? Say that again. He says in his introduction, and this is quoting Carl here, simply put, it's foolish to pretend the wrongs being done to white people under our current system aren't being done because they are white. Right? We're seeing this play out recently in the WNBA. Now, I'm not a WNBA fan. I don't think I've ever watched a WNBA game. That's Women's National Basketball Association. I would prefer the WNBA didn't exist. Indeed, if pressed to the wall, I might prefer if the NBA didn't exist, but that's another podcast. But when it comes to this idea of what Carl's getting at here, that our current system is discriminating against whites because they're whites, it's being seen and talked about now in the WNBA with a recent play of Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark, some of you may not know, is considered to the WNBA what Larry Bird was considered to the NBA back in the day. To put it bluntly, she's the great white female hope of the league. But the way that she's being treated by other black players is clearly because she's white. And there's envy going on here. So she's being discriminated against on the basis of the fact that she's being white. And Carl makes the case that that's happening not only in the WNBA, and he doesn't mention it, that's my illustration, but it's happening across the board in our culture. And this book labors to label that all the way through its work. As we continue with looking at the introduction, he says, today the advantages white Americans have are mostly informal and evanescent cultural legacies. The discrimination they experience is also sometimes informal, but is increasingly legal and formal. And then he builds the case that legally the white man is behind the cue ball. Or no, is that the black ball? I think that's the metaphor, behind the black ball. Although it wouldn't be a good thing to be behind the cue ball either. For example, affirmative action programs or policies, set-asides and quotas, all of these things are discriminatory against the white man. Carl says in his introduction, he says, finally, a few words as to why this book is necessary. America is in the midst of a rapid demographic and even civilizational transformation. I wonder if most white Anglo-Saxon Christians realize just that much. Do they realize that America is in the midst of a rapid demographic and even civilizational transformation? I mean, that's huge. To say that your whole civilization is being transformed. Well, if you're a party to the civilization that was, you may not be very excited about this demographic civilizational transformation. Demographic means the idea of the way the country is made up in terms of people. And, of course, the demographic transformation is coming from the reality of what Obama and Biden and even Bush before them, Bush number 2, did in opening up the borders so that we're being flooded. And now the flood is not just merely Hispanics. The most recent word is that the largest population push illegal across the border is Chinese. But we're in the midst of a rapid demographic and even civilizational transformation. And if you know anything about civilizational transformation or the way that civilizations change over time, you know that it's incremental. It doesn't just happen, boom, overnight. But what's happening here because the New World Order planned to have a universal, uniform world government. They're changing around the population centers, and they're transforming Europe. They're transforming Australia. They're transforming South Africa. Well, South Africa's already cooked. It's already baked. They're transforming America. And unless we start speaking about this, unless we decide that it is a hill to die on, we're the ones that are going to die. He goes on to say about this demographic and civilizational transformation. He says, Quoting here, large number of whites living either in disproportionately white areas or white enclaves in more diverse areas are in denial about the degree into which they have been replaced as a dominant ethnic group across much of America. They're in denial. And I think that's what's happened with the guys I thought were my friends when they said, we've got to drop you like a hot potato. I'm just paraphrasing here. They're in denial of the situation that it actually exists. Now, again, they may not have been aware of what Carl puts forth, or at least they may not have been aware of the depths of all this. But if I could wish for them to each buy a copy of this book. Indeed, I could wish for all Reformed people, Reformed Christians especially, to buy a copy of this book and to read it critically. And to ask yourself the hard questions that Carl poses. Indeed, I put down this book thinking it's too late. The transformation, the demographic transformation, the civilizational transformation, it's too late to pull back from. Carl still has some hope. And for a post-millennial, I guess I should have more hope. But when you read what he's done here, and when you realize also that his solutions perhaps aren't so good, we'll get into that much later, probably in another podcast, you begin to realize the precipice that we're on. And when you have children and grandchildren, your thoughts go there. I do pray constantly for myself that I would remember the Lord Christ's omnipotent rules, that he's the sovereign who sits at the right hand of the Father, ruling all the affairs of men. To be honest, listeners, I could not keep my equilibrium. I could not keep despondency or discouragement away from me if I wasn't confident that God is in heaven above and all is well on the earth. But that doesn't mean we don't consider these realities and look at them. He ends his introduction referring to Carl again here by noting, if we do not correct the course we're on, I fear we are headed for civil strife and racial violence that has characterized so many other multicultural countries over the centuries, including in the past our own. Kind of ironic in some ways. Charlie Manson, clear back in the 60s, was always aiming for part of his shtick, and he was a mental head case. Part of his shtick was to bring on a race war. And of course, everybody hated him for that, but because of the policies that have been pursued by both Republicans and Democrats, Carl is saying that's what we're on the brink of. And what's interesting is he notes that this is often a trait of multicultural countries. In the book Bowling Alone, I always forget the author's name of that, but in the book Bowling Alone, he brings out the same kind of information, that when you jam people from other cultures, from other races, from other ethnicities, when you jam them together in one demographic area, you have set up a powder keg. Right? Now, we're going off a little bit of a rabbit trail here. We'll get back to Clark in a second, but it's in the interest of the megastate. It's in the interest of the God state to try to create this kind of atmosphere where you're jamming people from a lot of demographics together into one geographic area. Because when you do that, as we've noted here, you're inciting conflict, and the only ones who can provide relief for the conflict is, guess who? That's right, the God state. And so it's in the interest of the God state to create this kind of havoc, because they're creating, in doing so, they're creating a need for themselves in order for their abilities to so-called keep the peace, so-called. When we move on to Jeremy Clark's work in chapter 1, it's called The Lay of the Land. Here he gives a basic overview of what he's going to be talking about. He has a fascinating quote from Alexei de Tocqueville in his book Democracy in America. And I'll open this discussion of chapter 1 just by quoting from de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville offered in America, and remember de Tocqueville wrote in the early 1800s, I think it was around 1830s I recall. In America, the majority raises formidable barriers around the liberty of opinion. Within these barriers, an author may write what he pleases, but woe be unto him if he goes beyond those barriers. Before making public his opinions, he thought he had sympathizers. Now it seems to him that he has none anymore, since he revealed himself to everyone. Then those who blame him criticize him loudly, and those who think as he does keep quiet and move away without courage. I think that's a fantastic quote because I've experienced this in my own life. They move away without courage. On the sidelines, they're patting you on the back. Yeah, you go get him. But when the fecal matter hits the fan, all of a sudden, you discover how many friends you really have.
What are you talking about? I never supported you. Well, you know what? Oh, sorry, Mr. Public Guy. I don't know him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. De Tocqueville lands on an issue here that needs to be spoken of, frankly, and that's the idea of courage. He says they move away without courage. That is, the ones who privately supported you. Now, when you're between the crosshairs, now they move away without courage. And I think courage is one of the chief virtues that is needed right now in this particular time and particular age. It would be, I understand the temptation to not have courage. I do have clergy friends around the country who agree with me privately, but they would never say publicly the things that I've said. And the things that I've said are just, again, what the fathers have said throughout church history. And they don't because they have families to think of, they have careers to think of. And I honestly, I get that. I understand that. But at some point, more and more people are going to have the courage to step forth and say, and I know this sounds dramatic and maybe it's a little corny, but we will not go silently into the night. We're going to have our voices heard. We're not going to be snuffed out. And all of this falls underneath, by the way, the sixth commandment. The sixth commandment is thou shalt not kill. And if you read your Westminster Confession, when they talk about how you define killing or what is killing or murder, they include the idea that we're not allowed to kill ourselves, right? And if we don't start standing up on these issues, we are committing the sixth commandment against ourselves, against our people. And that's a violation of the sixth commandment. And so this strong contending for Americans to wake up, for the white man to wake up, is rooted in ultimately not wanting to be annihilated. And that's consistent with the sixth commandment. As we continue to look at Clark, when he gives the lay of the land, he notes the fact that America was a country made by white people for white people. Now, even that statement, as obvious as it is, can get you into trouble. The Constitution talks about for us and our posterity, right? Well, who is the us that is signing the document, right? The us that's signing the document are white Anglo-Saxons, mostly Protestants, although there were some Catholics from Maryland, for example. And their posterity, therefore, would be who? It would be white Anglo-Saxons. Now, that may be a truth that you're not comfortable with, but it's the truth he also cites, that is, Clark cites in his book when he gives the lay of the land in chapter 1. He says the original Nationality Act of 1790 specifically restricted American citizenship to free white persons, right? And so the things that we're talking about here are historically grounded and rooted. It's not that anybody's arguing that we need to go on some kind of a rampage to start extraditing people, although I do support extraditing illegal immigrants. But it is the argument of realizing that as you dilute the heritage Americans, as you dilute the white Anglo-Saxons, you are changing the country. He goes on then, he talks about the unprotected class, and to be honest, I don't know why he titled the book The Unprotected Class. I think he should have titled the book The Unprotected Race. but it's possible that a publisher told him that couldn't fly. So he called it the Unprotected Class, and he gave it the subtitle of how anti-white racism is tearing America apart. He talks about some of the people that are at the front of the assault on white people. Sarah, I'm not sure how you pronounce this. Jeong. The J might be silent, but we'll pronounce it Jong. Once a member of the New York Times editorial board and later an opinion columnist tweeted, quote, "Oh man, it's kind of sick of how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men." He cites Ibram X. Kendi, and I don't think that's his real name. That's his pretend name, I think. He says he's one of the most prominent supporters of critical race theory, believes any federal policy can be defined as racist or anti-racist, and that you are racist if you support a racist policy through action or inaction. Right? So if you're not for affirmative action, for example, that therefore proves automatically that you're racist. He quotes from Robin DiAngelo, author of the bestseller White Fragility. And in that book, she says, "I'm often asked if I think the younger generation is less racist. No, I don't. In some ways, racism's adaptations over time are more sinister than concrete rules such as Jim Crow." So we've come upon a mix where we use the word racism to mean whatever we want it to mean. It's said that minorities can't be racist by definition because they don't have power plus privilege. Anymore, that's the way that racism is defined, as power plus privilege. The dirty little secret here is power plus privilege now belongs to those who don't have supposedly the power and don't supposedly have the privilege. The people who have power and privilege are the people who define themselves as not having power and not having privilege. I'll let you just cogitate on that for a bit to see how that's the case. He continues to talk about the flight from white. It's gotten so bad, he argues, that white people are now striving to disassociate themselves from being white. On surveys that they take, on census forms that they fill out, they understand that whiteness is no longer an advantage, and so because whiteness is no longer an advantage, they're clamoring to obtain a non-white identity. He cites from commentator Steve Saylor. Saylor calls this the flight from being white. The number of Hispanics identifying solely as white dropped by almost 53%. That's astounding. Between the year 2010 and 2020 in those respective census. And so the Hispanics have realized that whiteness is stigmatized and disadvantaged, whereby multicultural identity is sacralized. So we're already at the point now where people are consciously understanding that it's not to their advantage to be white, and so they're fleeing from that identity. What was the name of that chick who, Rachel something, Doziel? Was that it? She became...
Rachel Doziel. She faked being black for quite a long time, then she got found out.
Right. And part of that was so that she could be head of the NAACP, her regional or local chapter. And also, of course, she had the advantages then by being identified as black. She had the privileges that come with that. Carl goes on to talk about how this also is affecting Native Americans, and how all of a sudden that population is increasing by 4 million, over 4 million people between the 2010 and 2020 census. That's a 3% jump compared to 0.4% in 1970. And so more and more people are in the flight from being white. He throws out a lot of statistics here. He says as of 2020, nearly 50% of Americans under the age of 18 were minorities. Did you catch that? As of 2020, in that census, nearly 50% of Americans under the age of 18 were minorities. And that number is only growing. So we are going to be a minority, probably be a major minority for people for a while. In other words, we won't, at some point, we're no longer going to be 50%. We may be the largest minority grouping, but will no longer be 50%. Especially, we can see how that's true if nearly 50% of the Americans under the age of 18 are minorities. And so this is the lay of the land. It's no longer advantageous to be a white. People are fleeing from the identity of being white. They don't want to be known as white because they understand they're going to lose their power and privilege if they're white, such that it is. They understand that is now tipped in the direction of minorities. And so really it's the white person without power. It's the white person without privilege. This is the labor of the book, to teach this all the way, to show this, to demonstrate this all the way through in each subsequent chapter. He says he has some final thoughts when he gives the lay of the land here. He says, while confrontation around these issues is sometimes unpleasant, cowardly avoidance is much more dangerous. I've had people recently complain to me about expecting people to be confrontational. And I don't really expect people to be confrontational. I just expect them to notice. Or in other words, a big joke is you've committed the sin of noticing. All I want people to do is to notice things. They don't have to be confrontational. I just want them to notice things are true and then understand that it's their interest at some point to not just retreat. So I guess that there is at some point, there has to be a willingness to be confrontational. Although I always pray for myself that it'll be the issues wherein the confrontation is taking place and not the personality. And I know I can be guilty of that. I have an abrasive personality at times. I repent for that. I beg for God's mercy to engage these issues in a way that's as little confrontational as possible, while at the same time bringing these issues forth. And we note again, though, that we're living in times where nobody wants to hear these particular issues. Carl says if we continue to let the left engage in continuous and rampant race baiting without resistance, tensions will increase until they ultimately boil over, likely with terrible consequences. And of course, especially the Democratic Party race baits morning, noon, and night. Now, the Republicans think that they can play off of that, and they sometimes do the same thing. But Republicans will not do what Carl has done here. Republicans will not step up and say, we need to realize what this problem is. Some time ago, I can't remember if it was Steve Saylor or somebody else, somebody said if the Republicans were just concentrating in getting 2 or 3% more of the white vote and play less to minorities, they would be elected every cycle. But instead, Republicans play the minorities, and so they increasingly lose some of the white vote they might have otherwise have gotten. So we're going to continue to tease this out and to look at Carl's book. We're not being exhaustive. We're just picking out certain quotes here and then having a conversation with Carl and with ourselves about these. And we're going to pick this up. We're at about 38 minutes now. We're going to pick this up and start continuing to lead through this book. And again, we may spend several sessions here because I think this book, it could be a game changer. If people would realize the seriousness of the times. And that's part of the problem that we have. We don't know, Christians don't know what time it is. They're still living in this post-World War II civil rights consensus, and they don't realize that this is going to get their heads lopped off. And I hope I'm not speaking literally. But again, Carl suggests now more than once already, and we're just finished chapter 1, that if this situation is arrested, it's going to hit a boiling point. And that's why Carl wrote the book. He doesn't want that boiling point to be reached, and that's why we're reviewing the book, because I don't want that boiling point to be reached. And so with that in mind, I wish you Godspeed, and I trust that you'll continue to tune in as we continue to look through Jeremy Carl's book, The Unprotected Class.
Oh, brothers, can you hear my voice, or am I all alone? If there's no fire to guide my way, then I will start my own.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.
We'll get there yet.